What I want to do is begin with you now the first of what I plan to be 20 lectures through church history. It's a very short time, 20 hours is, to consider a very big subject. We're going to be going through it very quickly. It's really just sort of a survey of church history. And I have to confess to you, I'm really not a historian. I do have some background in history. My major at university, I went to the University of California at Santa Barbara, and my major there was history, and I was able to focus on the history of Europe and the history of Christianity. But by no means am I a trained historian. I'm not a PhD in history. To me, it would seem kind of audacious to write a book about history, but just because that's not my training. What I am by training is a Bible teacher. Yet nevertheless, I, like many Christians, have a real interest in church history and believe that there's a lot that we can learn from it. And the thing I'd like to call your attention to first is Psalm 78, 1 through 8. And I have to tell you, I hope this doesn't depress you, but we're not going to take much look at the Bible at all during our 20 hours of lecture. It would be an exciting thing to do, to really take your time and do Bible study interweaved with church history. Because so much of church history is very powerfully illustrated. So much of the Bible and the ideas of the Bible, the principles of the Bible is very powerfully illustrated throughout church history. But that's really not the essence of what we're going to be doing together. That would be a great series of lectures for me to do another time. I'm not prepared to do those lectures, so you just have to take what I'm prepared to do. And that's 20 lectures through church history survey. But it's important that we take a look at this because Psalm 78, 1 through 8, really speak to us about the importance of learning from history. Did you see this? He says, "Give ear, O my people, to my law. Incline your ears to the words of my mouth. I will open my mouth in a parable. I will utter dark sayings of old, which we have heard and known, and our fathers have told us. We will not hide them from their children, telling to the generation to come the praises of the Lord and His strength and His wonderful works that He's done. For He established a testimony in Jacob and appointed a law in Israel, which He commanded our fathers, that they should make them known to their children, that the generation to come might know them, the children who would be born, that they may arise and declare them to their children, that they may set their hope in God and not forget the works of God, but keep His commandments, and may not be like their fathers, a stubborn and rebellious generation, a generation that did not set its heart aright, and whose spirit was not faithful to God." And it's very interesting to take a look at what the psalmist says about history and what God's people can learn from history. Mainly, he puts it in terms of negative lessons. Did you notice this? That they may arise and declare to the children of life, that they may set their hope in God, not in people, and not forget the works of God, but keep His commandments, and may not be like their fathers. The idea here of the psalmist is, it's really good for you to tell what happened in history and what happened in days past, for the reason that you would not learn, or you would not repeat their mistakes, I should say. Because I'll be very honest with you. The history of the church, the history of Christianity, by the way, there's some debate. Some people say, well, I'm not teaching the history of the church, I'm teaching the history of Christianity. Mainly, I'm going to be speaking in terms of church history. But you should know that there is a difference between church history and the history of Christianity, right? Because throughout the centuries, there have been many, and some of the most vital and spiritual expressions of Christianity have been outside of the institutional church. Nevertheless, I'll just use the broad phrase church history to cover it all. But when you're talking about church history, you're talking about a fairly dark story, are you not? You're talking about a record of a lot of failure. Now, please, I don't mean to imply that there were not some glorious achievements and successes in the history of the church. And there were, and we'll talk about those through the course of this survey. But nevertheless, the predominant story of church history tells us what not to do, how not to act, how to learn from the mistakes of the past. And this is exactly what the psalmist alludes to. It's good for us to know history, the history of God's works among His people, and how God's people have responded to God, so that we may not repeat their mistakes. Again, I also want to emphasize this. Church history is not Scripture. We base our faith and our belief on the Bible, not on church history. Sometimes it drives me crazy when I hear Christians say, well, you know, the early church fathers said, ... And they quote the early church fathers in a way that gives them more authority than the early church fathers deserve. As we're going to see this morning, the early church fathers got messed up pretty quick in a lot of vital areas. And the idea that you can just go back to the early church fathers and it's like a secondary Bible. No, 1,000 times no. We believe the Bible. And actually, if you take a look at the New Testament, it tells you how quickly and how easily it was for the earliest Christians, the apostolic Christians, to get off the track, right? So it doesn't surprise us that the early church fathers and others throughout the history of the church have also had similar challenges. And so we understand that we want to learn from what God has done among men and from what men have done towards God. The lessons that we learn from church history, they're often bitter and dark. Sometimes they're bright and glorious, but we need to take a look at both of them. Now, I just sort of want to set a historical framework here and give you an idea of the setting of Christianity in the context of world history. In the big picture, I want you to understand that Christianity is a faith that's concerned with big ideas. The Christian story is of cosmic significance. The last thing in the world anybody should think is that the Christian story is concerned with just the Jewish people, or just the European peoples, or just the people who have been influenced by what is commonly called Christendom. No way. The Bible is not only concerned with the entire planet, you could say the Bible is concerned with the entire cosmos. God is going to remake a new heavens and a new earth. We claim that this work of God that He's done, we claim that God's work in and through His people throughout the centuries is relevant not only for the people of one faith, but for the entire earth, the entire universe, which will be remade as part of God's plan. And so when we tell the story of church history, we're telling a big story in God's context. But secondly, what I want you to understand in the historical context is that at the time Christianity came upon the scene, there were four main civilizations representing higher culture upon the earth. Now again, what I'm leaving out of this list are aboriginal cultures, right? Certainly more primitive sort of cultures, but these were four cultures that represented higher civilization at the time. It would be China, India, the Persian Empire, and the Roman Empire. Now, of course, there were advancements in civilizations in the New World, certain Aztec and Mayan and Incan and things like this, but that's sort of another subject. In China, the Han Dynasty ruled China. And under the Han Dynasty, Confucianism was the state-supported religion. But there was also Taoism practiced. The Buddhism was introduced into China at the end of the Han Dynasty, but it did not gain a large following until later. In India, Hinduism was strong. Buddhism had come 5 centuries before Christianity, but Buddhism had also flourished in India. The Persian Empire was in constant competition with the Roman Empire, and the official religion was Zoroastrianism of the Persian Empire. And then the Roman Empire was marked by several different religious and philosophical ideas joined together by what you might call a generally pluralistic system. The Roman Empire was basically a landmass surrounding the Mediterranean Sea and then northward up to Britain and beyond. And so in the Roman Empire, philosophically, culturally, things that affected the mindset and the thinking of the culture at the time were such influences as this. There were the official religions. Now, the official religions were the ancient Roman cults. Now, these ancient Roman cults developed into the cult of the worship of the emperor. But it wasn't that way when Christianity first came on the scene in the Roman Empire. And we'll talk more about this idea of emperor worship later on. Secondly, there were the philosophies of Greek origin. Things like Platonism, Stoicism, Epicureanism, the Cynics, Neoplatonism. These things were all examples of Greek philosophy that were embraced, and many Romans were interested in them. They inherited them from classical Greek culture. Then there were also the mystery religions from the East. Egyptian, Syrian, Persian. You know, there are many people today that try to act as if Christianity was just very, very similar to some of these mystery religions from the East. There is some similarity between the mystery religions of the East and Christianity, but the differences are far more remarkable than any of the similarities. If you want to know how Christianity tried to express itself in a way that was like these mystery religions, that would be what we call Gnosticism, the heresy of Gnosticism, which we will discuss later on. But of course there were some similarities. These mystery religions had savior gods. Some of these savior gods had miraculous births. Some of these savior gods were resurrected from the dead. Some were built around Dionysus, some around Orcus, some around Attis and the great mother who loved him, some of them around Adonis, some of them around Mithra. And so these influences were out there in the Roman world. They didn't develop strong, especially if you want to call Mithra worship, did not develop strong in the Roman Empire until the end of the first century. In no way can anybody say that it was an influence upon Christianity. But you would have to say that the general state of the Roman Empire made it, in some ways, a very good place for the gospel to take root and spread. There's a remarkable little book that I read some years ago, and I'm afraid I can't even remember the author of it. But it was basically titled, When the Time Was Right. And the guy takes off from that scripture that Paul wrote, I believe it's in Galatians, isn't it? That he says that Jesus Christ came in the fullness of the time. And the idea behind that Greek expression is that when the time was just right, that's when Jesus came upon the scene. And what he does is he just kind of carefully goes through the characteristics and the position of the Roman Empire at that time, and points out at what a strategic time it was for Jesus to come upon the scene. When you think about it, at this time, the Roman political unity ensured peace. Some years before Jesus was ever born, Rome ceased being a republic and started becoming an empire under the reign of the former Octavian, known as Caesar Augustus. And this was Roman political unity. It was the unity of force. It was the unity of raw power, but it was unity nonetheless. So the Roman political unity ensured peace. This was the period of the famous Pax Romana, peace of Rome all over the empire. The Roman legal system ensured order. There was widespread trade across and beyond the Roman Empire, including the trade of ideas. It was a very active time philosophically. There was a generally common language, and that was Greek, and this was a huge advance. Around that whole map that I showed you, around the Roman Empire, if we go back a few slides, we can see it. This whole vast territory known as the Roman Empire, the dominant language, or at least the spoken language in most all the Roman Empire, dominant, of course they had their local languages that they spoke, but virtually everybody also spoke Greek, which was a massive advantage. If you think about it, on the day of Pentecost, when Peter preached to that great assembled crowd from so many different nationalities, from so many different places, do you know what language he preached to them in? He preached to them in Greek. And they all understood what he was saying. And so this was a remarkable thing. There was also the general religious pluralism of the empire. The Roman Empire was generally tolerant towards new religions. Their idea was that as long as religions didn't upset the peace of the society, they were fine with it. And then, of course, there were also good roads and a good infrastructure for travel. All of these things were very important in the advance and the spread of Christianity. But then we also remind ourselves that Christianity arrived into a distinct historical setting. There was a character to the Roman Empire and the Roman world at the time that the Christian message came. First of all, you should understand that the Roman Empire was young. As I just mentioned before, it was transformed from a republic. Now, a republic is ruled by laws and a senate, to an empire. An empire is ruled by an emperor. It's more of a dictatorship. And it was, that transition was made under the recent reigns of Julius Caesar and Caesar Augustus, starting about 27 BC. And at this time, what had been called Palestine, this is what the Romans called the biblically named area of Judea, they called it Palestine. It had been incorporated into the Roman Empire and ruled as an occupied territory. It seethed with unrest against Roman rule. Now, it's sort of interesting to consider this, because you have to understand how the Romans ran things. There were probably no Roman troops, or not many Roman troops, in Palestine at the time of Jesus. Because there were actually probably troops from Egypt and Syria who were brought into the Roman Empire's armies. This is what the Roman Empire did. When it conquered lands, it brought their armies into their own armies and occupied them and ran them. It would have been led by Roman leaders and Roman soldiers and such, but the predominant soldiers occupying Judea probably were more of Middle Eastern origin rather than of Roman or Latin origin. But the Romans carried on this policy of Alexander the Great of hiring the armies of the peoples that they conquered. Now, there weren't huge numbers of soldiers in occupied Judea because it was fairly quiet. The big widespread rebellions didn't happen until later in the first century. But yet, it's important to realize, too, how Pontius Pilate became the prefect of Judea. You understand that Judea had at one time been an independent client kingdom in the Roman Empire under the Idumean king, Herod the Great. You remember Herod the Great, the king at the time of Jesus' birth. Well, at that time, Judea was not administered as a Roman colony. Instead, Herod was a client king of the Romans. But after King Herod died, his son Archelaus inherited the kingdom, which he continued to govern for another 6 or 7 years. But his rule was so brutal and inept that his subjects, that is the Jews, appealed to Caesar Augustus in Rome to be made a province of the Roman Empire. It's sort of interesting. The reason why Palestine was made a Roman province instead of an independent client kingdom was because the leaders of the Jews asked the Romans to come in and do it. But once they did it, the people especially didn't like it. And so it was ruled in biblical times by Tiberius Caesar. That was the Caesar at the time. And Pilate was appointed by Tiberius Caesar and held his position in Palestine for about 10 years, from AD 26 to 36. We also know that this historical setting of Christianity meant that the Jewish religious establishment, especially the temple, was dominated by the party of the Sadducees. Of course, this is a biblical mention of the Sadducees. Another very prominent party were the Pharisees. The Pharisees were the spiritual heirs of the movement to keep Judaism pure from the influence of Hellenism, way back under the period of the Maccabees. There were also minority ascetic movements, such as the Essenes, who were responsible for the Dead Sea Scrolls. And there was also a real sense of messianic expectation. This is very important to understanding the New Testament environment. People were expecting and wanting the Messiah. Do you want to know how deep the expectation was for the Messiah? It was so deep that when Jesus spoke to an anonymous Samaritan woman at a well, this is what she said. She said that she knew that the Messiah was coming. That's how deep the messianic expectation was. Now, considering all these advantages, the advantages of the Roman world, the historical setting, you still have to say that the success of Christianity is an incredibly unlikely story. Christianity went from a despised, illegal, persecuted religion to become the dominant force of Western civilization and world civilization. I don't know what you could make likened unto it today. Again, a small, despised, illegal, persecuted religion. again, it kind of fails me to make a historical analogy that you could grab onto today. I'll make an analogy that's offensive. I apologize for the offense of this analogy, but I think you'll understand what I would mean. It would be as if Scientologists, right? The group of Scientologists, small, despised. Now, you can't really say that Scientologists are persecuted because they're so adversarial and they get out a million lawyers against anybody who opposes them. But if you can imagine Scientologists who were effectively persecuted, okay? If that group, 200 years from now or 300 years from now, would dominate civilization in the world, that would be analogous to the same kind of remarkable rise of Christianity in its history. So this is one of the most remarkable stories in all of history to see how Christianity came to its place in civilization. All right, the next thing I want to do in this first session is talk to you about the idea of history in general. It's important that we understand that Christianity is a historically grounded faith. Christianity is not primarily a religion founded upon philosophical truths. Let me say that again. Christianity is not primarily a religion founded on philosophical truths. Christianity is fundamentally a religion founded upon historical events. You guys know your Bibles. In 1 Corinthians chapter 15, when Paul sets out to describe the gospel, what does he say the gospel was that he delivered to the Corinthians, and by the way, all over the Roman world? He defines his gospel like this: the death, the burial, and the resurrection of Jesus. Now let me tell you something flat out. The death, the burial, and the resurrection of Jesus are not philosophical ideas. They're historical events. And they stand or fall as historical events. And the New Testament presents to us a historical story. God moved in history. This is not Goldilocks and the Three Bears. This is not Once Upon a Time. This is not edifying stories which may or may not be true. How many of you have heard the story of George Washington and the cherry tree, right? Primarily an American audience. You've heard the story of George Washington and the cherry tree, right? He went out as a boy, he chopped down the cherry tree, and he was asked about it by his father, and what did he say? Father, father asked him if he did it. He said what? I cannot tell a lie. I did it. We all admire George Washington. You've heard that story. Did you know that it's utterly false? That it never happened. That a man named Parson Weems, I want to say 100 years, I should have looked it up, I'm doing the spontaneous, but let's just say some 100 years after George Washington ever lived, he made up the story. And he made it up just to be a good moral story to inspire young American children to tell the truth, right? Now that's a nice story, it's useful and all of that, but it matters, does it not, that it's not true? Well, Christianity is a story that is fundamentally historically true. And if it is not historically true, then it's nothing. If Jesus didn't really live, if Jesus didn't really die on a cross, if Jesus wasn't really buried and rose from the dead, then our belief is in vain. So you need to understand the fundamentally historical character of what we do. Now, saying that, some people criticize the New Testament, saying that its historical environment is all turned back upon itself, that all it does is claim historical things that have no basis in secular history. Sometimes people question whether or not secular history confirms the existence of Jesus Christ. Let me tell you, absolutely it does. Secular historians in ancient times confirmed the existence and the ministry of Jesus of Nazareth. And let's just run through some quick examples. The historian Thallus mentioned Jesus and the historical events mentioned in the Gospels in a history that's lost, but was later quoted by early Christians like Julius Africanus. Now, Thallus made specific mention of the darkness that came upon the whole earth when Jesus died. And he explained it as an eclipse. But, by the way, an eclipse is an impossible explanation for that darkness. Does anybody know what? because it was the time of the Passover. Passover always happens at a full moon, and an eclipse is impossible at a full moon. Well, so he explained it as an eclipse, but that was not an adequate explanation of the supernatural darkness that came upon the earth at that time. There's a letter from the Syrian Mara bar Serapan. He wrote a letter to his son speaking of Jesus in a completely historical context. The Jewish historian Josephus wrote about Jesus, and Josephus clearly speaks of Jesus as a historical person. Josephus also confirms the historicity of many New Testament events. Now, some people say that Christians, early Christians, corrupted this quotation to their own advantage. They read the quotation of Josephus and they say, this is too good to be true. It had to be corrupted by early Christians. But I want you to know this. When Origen cited Josephus in AD 250, and when Eusebius quoted Josephus in AD 325, this is exactly how the quotation read. By the way, Josephus also made mention of John the Baptist and James the Just, that is James, the half-brother of Jesus. Lucian was a Roman comedian who wrote a play mocking Christians, but again, he treated Jesus as a completely historical person. The Talmud repeatedly mentions Jesus as a historical person. About AD 150, Justin Martyr made reference to documents which he believed to be in the archives at Rome, and that he even referenced Pilate's report back to the emperor about what happened when this one, with this one who was named Jesus. And then also we have the repeated confirmation of the book of Acts. By the way, when Justin Martyr wrote to a Jew named Trypho in the year AD 147, he could confidently say this, quote, "You Jews knew that Jesus was risen from the dead and ascended into heaven as the prophecies did foretell was to happen." He could just refer to this as a piece of common knowledge in the historical context.
Who for that, Justin?
Justin Martyr was his name right there. Obviously, Martyr wasn't his last name. He was a martyr, and so this is usually the title that's given to him. But that's by what he's known by in church history. Now, as well, we need to say that the historical reliability of the book of Acts, and I'll say the Gospels as well, is also confirmed by secular history. You know, there was a time when the dominant scholars in the academic world liked to say that the book of Acts was sort of a romance novel of the early church, written more than 100 years after the event supposedly happened. But all of this theory was absolutely destroyed by a man named William Ramsey. He was a noted archaeologist and Bible scholar. He proved that the historical record of Acts is remarkably accurate regarding the specific practices, laws, customs, and so forth of the period that it claims to relate. It's definitely the work of eyewitnesses. Let me read you a quote from the mid-1960s by a guy named Sherwin White. He was an expert in Greco-Roman history from Oxford. This is what he wrote about the book of Acts. Quote, "The historical framework is exact. In terms of time and place, the details are precise and correct. As documents, these narratives belong to the same historical series as the record of provincial and imperial trials in the epigraphical and literary sources of the 1st and 2nd centuries AD. For Acts, the confirmation of historicity is overwhelming. Any attempt to reject its basic historicity, even in matters of detail, must now appear absurd. Roman historians have long taken it for granted." Now listen, a scholar may not believe the message of the book of Acts, right? The message, the theological message about who Jesus is and what he has done on our behalf. But there is no scholarly or historical basis for doubting the events of the book of Acts, or the events of the gospel for that, as they are recorded. Let me conclude with this quote by F.F. Bruce. And when I say conclude, I mean conclude this portion, because there's much, much more for us to go. But let me conclude with this quote from F.F. Bruce. He says, "Some writers may toy with the fancy of a Christ myth, but they do not do so on the basis of historical evidence. The historicity of Christ is as axiomatic for an unbiased historian as the historicity of Julius Caesar. It is not historians who propagate the Christ myth theories. All right, well, enough in the sort of introductory thing to talk about the general idea of history and how history relates and connects to Christianity. Do we have any quick questions before we go on to our next section? All right. By the way, just let me let you know for the class, if you've got a question and I ask for a question, you better jump on it. I'm not going to sit around and gaze lovingly into your eyes for about 30 seconds while I wait for somebody to get the courage to ask a question. Just ask it. It's okay. Raise your hand and ask a question. It's fine. But if I offer up questions, jump on it. Let's do it. Okay. Now, let's begin our survey of actual church history. And I want you to know that I, rather arbitrarily, different people who study history and lecture on history divide things in different ways, but I have rather arbitrarily divided church history into these 5 periods. The period of the Apostolic Church, the period of the early church, the period of the Christian Empire, the period of the Reformation, and then Christianity in a more modern world. Now, obviously, these are not rigid dividing lines, right? It's not like on New Year's Day, AD 100, right? You instantly came into the period of the early church. These are approximate dates. But what's important for us to understand is there are these general periods of church history. And so what I want to talk to you quickly now about, and I really do mean quickly, is this period of the Apostolic Church. The Apostolic Church is the church of the apostles. It's the New Testament church. It is the most important period of church history to cover, and it is going to be the briefest and most inconsequential period of church history that we actually do cover. If that seems ironic to you, it's just for this purpose. That as you learn the Bible, you should be learning apostolic church history, right? That's why we're not going to focus on it in this class. Because you should be learning through a careful study of the Gospels and a careful study especially of the book of Acts, but also all the New Testament epistles as well. You should be learning apostolic church history. So what were the characteristics of the apostolic church? Well, first of all, of course, they had the authoritative presence of the apostles and prophets as expressed in the writing of the New Testament. The great verse that you have to remember in this context is Ephesians chapter 2, verse 20, that says that the church was built upon the foundation of the apostles and prophets, Jesus Christ himself being the chief cornerstone. Yes?
I had a Mormon friend who used that for basis on why they have prophets and stuff like that.
Well, this is where your Mormon friend is completely off base in that. Because it says that the church was built upon the foundation of the apostles and prophets. In other words, it's a foundation. Do you keep having to lay a new foundation every generation? No! That foundation was laid in the first century. And if you really want a critical example of this, look at apostolic history in the New Testament. Okay? Now, when Judas committed suicide, did they replace him in the apostolic group? Yeah. Yes. They replaced him with Matthias, right? Okay? So they replaced Judas. Who was the next apostle to die? Does anybody know? No, it was not Thomas. It was James. That's recorded in the book of Acts. James was martyred. Here's the critical thing. Did they replace James? No. Right? For your Mormon friend to be correct, they would have instantly said, oh, well, James has died. We've got to replace James. They did not replace James. They replaced Judas because Judas was taken out of their number in an ungodly and unreasonable way. It was not right. God told them to replace them. But it was not the practice, it was not the custom of the New Testament to replace, because the apostles and prophets of the New Testament laid a foundation. We have this foundation where? In our New Testament. That's our foundation from the apostles and prophets. And this foundation being laid, we do not need another foundation. Now, the second characteristic of the apostolic church that I would give to you is that, well, by the way, I would say, there are no longer today apostles and prophets in an authoritative sense. In a sense, there are apostles in the church today. In a sense, there are prophets in the church today. There are people as prophets whom God has given a wonderful and unique message, that it's their mission, it's their job to bring that message to the church. There are people who are prophets, as apostles. And I would say in a sense, apostles are people that God has called to have a unique role of leadership in the church. Men who are not just leaders of congregations, but who are leaders of movements. There is a sense in which those men are apostles. But they are nothing like the New Testament apostles. They do not have apostolic authority as the New Testament apostles. So there was the authoritative presence of the apostles and prophets. Secondly, we can say that there was a church life that was glorious, but then also not so glorious. Right? Let's not kid ourselves about the Apostolic Church. If you think that the Apostolic Church was just all sweetness and light and glory, and everybody was holy, and everybody was righteous, and everybody was serving the Lord just powerfully and beautifully, read the book of 1 Corinthians. And then when you're done with that, read 2 Corinthians. And then when you're done with that, read Colossians. And then when you're done with that, read Galatians. Read these New Testament books, and you'll see that yes, the New Testament church is our model. Yes, we have lots to learn from it. But even the New Testament church, which was probably the best the church has ever been, the church has never come up to the level that it was at during the New Testament church. Nevertheless, we do not over-romanticize it and make ourselves think that it was perfect. So it was marked by a church life that was glorious, and then also not so glorious. But it was also marked by a spreading gospel. The gospel spread in the apostolic era. It spread from Jerusalem to Judea. It spread from Judea to Samaria. It spread from Samaria to the uttermost parts of the earth. So that basically at the end of the apostolic period, Christianity had expanded all around the central Roman Empire. It had not yet gotten to Britain. It had not yet gotten beyond up into northern Europe, but certainly all around the Mediterranean Sea, Christianity was existing and vibrant. About the year AD 150, a Christian wrote this to the Roman emperor about the growth of Christianity. He said this: "We are but of yesterday, and we have filled all that belongs to you. The cities, the fortresses, the free towns, the very camps, the palace, the senate, the forum. We leave to you the temples only." Christians said this. As early as 150, Christians had spread everywhere across the Roman Empire. Now, they were not the dominant cultural force. No. But they were everywhere. There was a very strong Christian minority in the Roman Empire by the end of the apostolic period. The other notable thing that we want to notice about this apostolic period is that it was marked by a transition of Christianity from being a branch of Judaism to Christianity being a faith in its own right and then not recognized as a legal religion. Now understand this. The Roman Empire claimed the right to declare some religions legal and some religions illegal. Okay? The Latin terms they used for this were religio licita and religio illicita. A licit or permitted religion, or an illicit or an unpermitted religion. Now, Judaism was approved in the Roman Empire as an accepted religion, right? The average Roman didn't dig the Jewish thing, right? They didn't like it. They thought it was vain. They thought it was superstitious. They didn't really feel comfortable with the Jews. There was some measure of anti-Semitism in the Roman Empire. But they said, okay, look, you Jews can have your religion. It's okay. We'll allow it. Judaism was a permitted religion. And when Christianity first came up, Christianity was viewed, legitimately so, as a branch of Judaism, right? So were Christians legal in the apostolic period? Well, yes, in the beginning of the apostolic period they were, because they were considered to be a branch of Judaism. But as time went on, the Jews did not like the Christians being sheltered under their umbrella. Judaism began to distance itself from Christianity, and Christianity began to distance itself from Judaism. Christianity had to have its own status before the Roman Empire, and Christianity was declared an illicit or illegal religion. For the most part, by the end of the apostolic period, the Jewish people were offended that this group of Christians found legal protection under their umbrella. It's as if all cults were outlawed in a nation, but Christianity was accepted, and then Jehovah's Witnesses found legal protection by calling themselves Christians. Christians might be offended at that, right? They might look at, what, don't protect them under our umbrella, right? This was exactly the situation for Christianity. So at the beginning of the apostolic period, Christianity was okay with the Roman Empire because it was under the Jewish umbrella. But then later in the apostolic period, it came out from the umbrella of Judaism and was declared an illegal religion. This led to the next point I want to make. It was the beginning of state-sponsored persecution. Now, there is a very significant difference between official persecution and unofficial persecution. Every Christian who is a Christian should at some time or another face unofficial persecution. You know what I mean by that, right? You're socially rejected. You're screamed at the street. You're rejected among your family or friends. You're mocked at. People laugh at you. That's what passes for severe persecution today. People laugh at us. Oh heavens, how can we ever bear that, you know? I tell you, one of the things about looking at church history, particularly early church history, you look at the courage of ancient Christians and it's humbling, right? We are terrified at having somebody laugh at us. And they face lions. You know, and it just sort of shakes you into perspective, right? So every Christian at some time or another should face unofficial persecution. And we find unofficial persecution all throughout the book of Acts. The persecution that Christians faced in the book of Acts was not by the Roman government, right? It was by, for the most part, Jewish mobs that followed around and didn't agree with the preaching of the gospel. Because there was a very mixed reception among the Jewish people to the Christian message. Some people accepted it, some people tolerated it, and some people persecuted it vigorously. But in this period of apostolic Christianity, state-sponsored persecution began in a significant way. And it basically began with the burning of Rome. On July 19th, AD 64, a fire broke out in the working class section of Rome. For 7 days it raged, and it destroyed block after block of crowded tenement housing. Legend has it that Caesar Nero fiddled while Rome burned, and many people in his own day thought that he had in fact set the fire. Now, many modern historians believe that this was Nero's brutal attempt at urban renewal, because he took and built upon much of that burned out area. He took it for himself and built upon it. Now, whether he set the fires himself, not personally, he of course had his men do it, or whether he just used something that happened, he blamed it on the Christians. Therefore, after Rome burned, not the whole city, but the significant neighborhoods in Rome, Nero promised to hunt down and kill Christians. Now, the Roman historian Cornelius Tacitus wrote about Nero's persecution of Christians in his own day. This is an interesting quote from Tacitus. He says, "Accordingly, an arrest was made of all who pled guilty. Then, upon their information, and in Rome, an immense multitude was convicted, not so much on the charge of arson as because of their hatred of the human race." Notice something very quickly, what Tacitus says. First of all, did you notice? An immense multitude was convicted. What does that tell you about the spread of Christianity in Rome? There were a lot of Christians, right? AD 64, there were a lot of Christians. Secondly, they were convicted not so much of charge of arson because of their hatred of the human race. That's what the Romans accused the Christians of. You hate us. By the way, why would they say that Christians hated Romans? Well, because they didn't want to share in their same sinful activities. Right? They didn't want to share in their party lifestyle and their temple debauchery, in the brothels that they went to, in their drunkenness and all that. The Christians just basically wanted to keep to themselves, preach the gospel, bring people to Jesus, and love one another. And for that, they were branded as haters of the human race. Besides being put to death, they were made to serve as objects of amusement. They were clad in the hides of beasts and torn to pieces by dogs. Others were crucified, others set on fire to illuminate the night when daylight failed. This is how brutally Nero persecuted the Christians. Tacitus himself saw that Christians were being destroyed not for the public good, he says, but to gratify the cruelty of an individual. By the way, I'll give you my theory here. This is my theory. I can't prove it. But my theory is that Caesar Nero lashed out so viciously against the Christians after Paul preached to him. Because it was before Caesar Nero that Paul would have preached to at the end of the book of Acts. And I believe it was after Nero rejected the gospel offered by Paul that he went even more insane. And sometime after that began this vigorous persecution of the Christians. I can't prove that historically, but it makes sense to me. Tradition also tells us that both Peter and Paul were martyred in Rome during this time of persecution under Nero. So again, quick characteristics of the Apostolic Church. I don't want to belabor, but we're going through this very quickly. Probably the most beneficial thing we could do is spend all of our time just talking about the Apostolic Church. But we've got more to consider. That's why we're considering just one part of our very first session. It was marked by the authoritative presence of the apostles and prophets. It was marked by church life that was glorious and not so glorious. It was marked by a spreading gospel. It was marked by the transition between being under the umbrella of Judaism and then being a religion in its own right. And then finally, it was marked by the beginning of state-sponsored persecution. Now, in the few minutes that we have left in this lecture, we want to talk next about the early church. Do you understand the distinction between the Apostolic Church and the early church? Right? The Apostolic Church is the church of the apostles. Very good. All right. When the apostles die and the baton is passed, so to speak, to their successors, we begin the period of the early church. And the early church pretty much takes up the period from the end of the Apostolic Church, which if you want to give some kind of date to it, you can say around 100 AD, the death of the Apostle John. We don't know exactly when he died, but just give the rough figure of 100 AD. Approximately from 100 AD until the time of the conversion of Constantine, that's 314 AD, that 200 years or so there is what we call the period of the early church. So we're just going to consider a few things about the early church here in this lecture and then continue it on in our second lecture. First of all, how did Christians meet and worship in the period of the early church? Well, they mainly met in homes. Now, at the beginning of this period, Christians mostly met in small gatherings with no church buildings to speak of. Meetings were held in homes. Why? Because homes were more spiritual. And everybody knows that it's more spiritual to have a house church than it is to have a church in a bigger place. Is that why early Christians met in homes? No. Early Christians met in homes because they had to. They couldn't have their own church buildings. Now, someone may debate whether or not home churches are more spiritual than bigger churches. And listen, if somebody's into the home church thing, God bless them. But I don't want them looking back to the early church and saying that the early church met in homes because they thought it was more spiritual. The early church met in homes because they had to, and as soon as they had the opportunity to purchase church buildings, they did. By the way, that came later in the 200s and around 250. As the period developed, Christians bought and built church buildings as they were able to. By the end of the early church building, by the end of the early church period, Christians were very dominantly meeting in churches instead of in homes.
What year?
Well, around 200 they started being, and so just as the period progressed, there's just sort of a general progression throughout the period. But notice this. The problem with having a church building is it also becomes a target for persecution, right? And so church buildings would be built, they'd be attacked or burned down, they'd be built again, this kind of thing throughout this period. It's wonderful to read some of these early descriptions of church meetings. There's a wonderful description by a man named Pliny the Younger of an early church meeting. Pliny the Younger was a governor over Bithynia in Asia Minor, some of the territory described in the book of Acts and in 1 Peter. He wrote about the year 112, so early, right? Early in the church period. Listen to this beautiful description he makes of an early church meeting. He says, on an appointed day, the Christians are accustomed to meet at daybreak and recite or sing a hymn to Christ as to a God, and bind themselves by an oath to abstain from the theft and robbery, adultery, and breach of faith. After this, they depart and meet again to take food. To find out the truth concerning them, I applied torture to 2 maidservants who were called deaconesses, but I found nothing but a depraved and extravagant superstition. Now, what's amazing about this is, first of all, how beautifully he describes early church meetings, right? They get together, they meet at dawn, they sing together, they bind themselves together with oaths, they listen to a sermon, they abstain from theft and robbery. That's probably what he's describing about the bind themselves together with an oath. They depart, they meet again later, they take food together, they have a potluck supper together and enjoy communion together. But then notice how casually he describes this persecution. To find out the truth concerning them, I applied torture to 2 maidservants who were called deaconesses. So he just gets a couple of the leading women of the church and he tortures them. What do you believe? What are you into? And what answers did he get? I found nothing but a depraved and extravagant superstition. What would Pliny likely call a depraved and extravagant superstition?
That a God walked on the earth.
Well, to a Roman mind, that wasn't so crazy, right? They had gods who walked the earth all the time. But a God who was crucified, a God who had the power to destroy Roman legions but loved instead, a God who rose from the dead, a God who told his followers to endure suffering and to endure injury and insult from others and to endure persecution and to love their enemies and to accept all people, slave, free, Greek, barbarian, rich, poor, to accept them all. You can see where Pliny would describe that as a depraved and extravagant superstition. There's another wonderful description of an early church meeting by a guy named Justin Martyr. Again, about the year 150, he gave another description of a church service. He says this: at the end of the prayers, we greet one another with a kiss. Then the president of the brethren has brought bread and a cup of wine mixed with water. He takes them and offers praise and glory to the Father of the universe. And through the name of the Son and of the Holy Ghost, he gives thanks at considerable length for being counted worthy to receive these things in his hands. And when he has concluded the prayers and the thanksgiving, all the people present express their joyful assent by saying, Amen. And he goes on and on in his description. Again, but it's just, listen, you want to know a misconception that people have about the church, the early church? They think it was very, very different from what we do today. Now listen, it was different, right? They didn't have a nice room like this to meet in. They didn't have comfortable tables and MacBooks and, the things you have in front of you right now, and nice warm clothes and indoor plumbing. And they didn't have many of these things. But basically, I think that these early Christian services were more like what we do today than people commonly think. Again, I'm not trying to say that they're exactly the same. Not at all. They were somewhat more ritualistic, right? They would probably observe the Lord's Supper even more because they would have a potluck supper every week. You want to know one of the reasons why? It's because for the poor and the slaves among them, that was often the only decent meal they got all week. It was a real expression of Christian love and charity. It was almost a combination soup kitchen and communion, having it together every week. So there certainly were some differences, but not as radical as I think many of the differences people today often say. Now you see, very much like Christians of all ages, Christians in the early church led lives that were normal, but not normal. I love this letter to Diognetus by an unknown Christian. This is beautiful. He says this: for Christians are not distinguished from the rest of mankind in country or customs. For they do not live somewhere in cities of their own, or use some distinctive language, or practice a peculiar manner of life. Though they follow local customs in dress and food and the rest of their living, their own way of life which they display is wonderful and admittedly strange. They take part in everything like citizens and endure everything like aliens. Like everyone else, they marry, they have children, but not a common bed. They remain on earth, but they're citizens of heaven. To me, that's a beautiful description of what these early Christians are like. I'm a little bit tempted. Let's just press through. We'll go a few minutes over our hour allotment, but not too much. And we'll talk about the last point that I wanted to make in this first lecture, and that is simply this: what persecution against these Christians in the early period of the church was like. In the period of the early church, we need to understand the nature and the severity of persecution against early Christians. First of all, persecution was never constant or universal. Sometimes you have it in your mind that to be a Christian in the early church meant that you were constantly persecuted. It's not true. Now, persecution was often a shadow that lived over the church, but it was never universal and it was never constant. It came in waves that might rise or fall according to the whim of the emperor or the local governor. Local governors had great authority to determine how energetically Christians would be persecuted. And persecution could also take many different forms. Sometimes it was economic and social, but sometimes it was also violent. And so persecution was complicated. It wasn't universal at any one time all over the Roman Empire, and it was never constant for this period of some 200 years. But there were some significant periods of persecution. First of all, under Nero, his persecutions were not particularly widespread, but his persecutions were famous for both their sadism and their notable victims, such as Peter and Paul. Decius was the next. He embarked on a revival of paganism and began the first empire-wide persecution. And the offering of incense to the image of the emperor was demanded under Decius. Then you have Valerian. Under him, persecution was mostly economic and legal. Christians had their property confiscated and were denied the right to legally assemble for worship. It was during periods such as the reign of Valerian, not exclusively to him, but such as times like that, that Christians would meet in secretive places, right? They would be forced to meet in catacombs, right? Because of the danger. Now, the catacombs are sort of an interesting and complicated thing, but there would be certain times when Christians would regularly meet there. Otherwise, they would just meet there as sort of a memorial service in memory of a martyr. But then finally, Diocletian. His reign saw Christians suffer the worst persecution of all. Churches were destroyed, Bibles were burnt, all civil rights of Christians were suspended, and sacrifice to the Roman pagan gods was commanded. I want you to notice this. This was late in the term of the early Christian period, right? The worst persecution of all happened in this period, ending at 311. I want you to remember that, because when we come back to later periods of church history, that's going to become very important, okay? But remember, the very severe persecution under Diocletian. Now, why were Christians persecuted so viciously by the Roman Empire? Who did the Christians want to hurt? Were the Christians trying to start some kind of revolution? No, not at all. Why were they persecuted so vigorously? Well, let me give you a few reasons, and we'll sort of conclude with this. The main reason was, number one, they were considered to be strange and antisocial. You know, when Ignatius, a notable early Christian, was an old man, the Roman Emperor Trajan made a visit to Antioch, and he was told that this bishop, Ignatius, of the despised and hated Christians, that he wanted to see him. Trajan spoke to Ignatius bitterly. Trajan said this to Ignatius: "There you are, you wicked devil, you deceiver of men." Ignatius said this: "I'm not an evil spirit, but I have Jesus Christ in my heart." And then Trajan said this: "Jesus Christ within you? You mean the one who was crucified by Pontius Pilate?" And Ignatius said, yes, he was crucified for my sins. When the emperor heard that, he said, take him to the arena. Let him be thrown before the wild beasts. The Romans could not handle this idea of a Savior who was crucified. To them it seemed the most offensive, bizarre thing that you would take a man who was condemned as a criminal by a Roman governor and crucified and make him your Savior and God. By the way, back to Pliny. Pliny was a Roman government official sent by Trajan to reorganize the affairs of Bithynia in 112. He read questions about how to conduct the persecution of Christians, so he wrote Trajan. That was the quote that we saw before. But Pliny had found that, quote, the insanity of Christianity had infected many of all ages and ranks, and that the temples were almost deserted, and that it was hard to sell food for the sacrificial animals. All of this surprised him, and he tried to bring Christians under control by arresting them, by executing some who would not burn a pinch of incense to Caesar. This is what Pliny said. He said, this is the course that I have adopted. I ask them if they are Christians. If they admit it, I repeat the question a second and third time, threatening capital punishment. If they persist, I sentence them to death, for their inflexible obstinacy should certainly be punished. Christians who are Roman citizens, I reserve to be sent to Rome. I discharge those who are willing to curse Christ, a thing which it is said genuine Christians cannot be persuaded to do. So you know what Trajan wrote back to Pliny? He said, okay, listen, Pliny, don't seek out Christians to arrest them. Don't energetically do them. But when they are exposed to you, or when people come to you as informants and say, that guy's a Christian, get him, go ahead and do it, and deal with them just the way that you described. This sort of casual persecution of Christians happened very, very prominently in the Roman Empire. And then there were also, within this atmosphere of somewhat persecution, there were those four major and significant periods of persecution. Well, that ends us now for this first lecture. Why don't we take about a 10-minute break and then come back for our second lecture, and then we'll be done for the morning. Okay?